What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today we're going to be working on a 2011 Volvo XC90 P2. Today on the P2 behind me, we're going to be covering how to replace your rear brakes. This is going to be applicable to all XC90 models, but the most important thing to know before purchasing brakes for your vehicle is to know what size brake disc your car came equipped with. If you're unsure, you can always reach out to our experts over at service@fcpo.com, provide them with your full VIN, and they'll be able to determine what size brake disc came on your Volvo. In front of me today we have a Zimmermann and Techstar kit. This is an OE kit, which typically will last you anywhere from 30 to 60,000 miles. It really depends on the kind of driving you do. These are heavy vehicles, so the brakes are going to be put under a little bit more pressure than they would, let's say, under a lighter car. A couple things to note: you can always do a visual inspection on your brakes before you determine if you need them or not. Simply take a look at the surface of the brake disc. If they start to develop a ridge either on the inner or outer portion of the surface, then more than likely you're going to want to replace them. You can always take a look at how much meat is left on your brake pads. There are gauges dedicated out there to measure that for you. Anything under 2 millimeters, you want to go ahead and replace them anyways. You'll notice there is no brake pad wear sensors. These vehicles do not use those. And one thing you may want to consider, but we do not have in front of us today, are the rotor set screws. They're usually 10 millimeter bolts. These are pretty easy to get on and off, unlike the hex or Torx that you'll see on other European vehicles. Before we get started on this DIY, let's take a look at some of the tools you're going to need for this job. For this DIY, we recommend you have some torque wrenches. We have two different size ones here that can do two different torque values. We have a 3/8 drive ratchet, a small flathead screwdriver. We have a caliper hook. You can also use a clothes hanger or a bungee cord or even a zip tie. The goal here is not to hang the caliper by the soft line. We have a small wire brush. You can use a wire wheel attachment on a drill. This is CTA 1465. This is what we're going to use to compress our piston back into our caliper. We have a 19 millimeter lug bolt socket. We have a 13, 10, and a 7 millimeter hex. We also have some brake clean, liquid moly ceramic paste. Some nice to haves would be a large impact to remove the wheel hardware, a paint pen if you want to mark down your hardware once you've torqued it down, and if you live in New England like we do, you may need a hammer to get the rotor off the hub. Oftentimes they will seize on there, especially from the rust, salt, and grime on the road. Now we know what tools we're going to need for this DIY. Let's go ahead and get started. First thing we're going to look at, and this applies to any brake job on any vehicle that you do, is you want to be aware of where your brake master cylinder reservoir is located, and you want to be aware of the fluid level in it. Now, we're doing brakes on this car. The fluid level is a little bit below the max line, and that's okay because when we compress those pistons, that's going to take up some volume that's then going to push some fluid back into the reservoir up here. So the last thing we want to do is over pressurize everything and cause a leak anywhere in the system, especially up here at the cap. If your fluid level is a bit too high and you know for a fact that you need brakes, I would recommend removing some fluid out, either with a turkey baster, a syringe, something that you can just extract the fluid with carefully. Obviously you don't want to empty out the reservoir, just take out enough that there's some room for some of that volume from the pistons going back in to go. From there you can top off once you're done with your brake job. But keep that in mind, it never hurts to take the cap off and just look at the fluid level and go from there. So with that in mind, now let's head over to the rear of the XC90 and get started on this brake job. All right, my good people, we are going to be working on the rear passenger side of the XC90 today. However, the process is going to be identical for both the driver and passenger side, so just copy and paste on the other side. First thing we're going to do is work on removing the 5 19 millimeter lug bolts that hold our wheel to the vehicle. For those of you following along at home that do not have a large impact on like we do here in the shop, I recommend that before you lift up the vehicle, you grab your breaker bar, your 19 millimeter socket, and just break all 5 lug bolts free. That way, once you jack up the vehicle, you can go ahead and remove them easier versus fighting the car or putting any unnecessary stress on the driveline. So we're going to use the impact gun today. We're just going to go ahead and zap these off. I already knew this wheel was going to be stuck. I just wanted to give it a shot and see if it would come off. So what I'm going to do is thread a lug bolt back on and just use my hammer. If you don't have something like this, you don't want to risk damaging the wheel, grab a block of wood, and you can use a block of wood in between your tire and the hammer so you don't damage anything. But the goal is here just to break the corrosion free that's keeping our wheel onto our hub. And taking a look at the hub, you can see the ring of corrosion that was holding our wheel on. So we'll be sure to clean this up during reinstall of the new parts, and we'll be sure to clean the inside of the wheel too, keep that nice and happy. But Moving forward, we have a better view of everything. Here's our set screw. Volvo uses 10mm bolts on these vehicles. We have our anti-rattle clip, our caliper, and then our caliper carrier. So first thing we're going to do is make sure that we can break this free. If you need to, go ahead and hit it with some PB Blaster or some of your favorite penetrating fluid. We're just going to make sure that that will come off. We're not going to take it off just yet. So for our set screw, we're going to use a 10mm socket on our ratchet here. And our goal is just to break it free. That's nice and loose, so we know we won't have to battle it later. Next thing on our list is going to be to remove our anti-rattle clip. I'm going to use a small flathead screwdriver for this, but basically the goal is just to pry it off the caliper. Now obviously if your vehicle has nicely painted calipers, you want to be a little bit more mindful about where you pry from and where you place your flathead. In this case, we're probably just cleaning up a little bit of rust if anything. Set this to the side, we're going to be reusing this. Next, we're going to go ahead and start by removing the 2 dust caps on the end of our guide pin boots. You want to make sure that your vehicle has these. The last thing you want is for debris to get in there. That's going to cause you a mess of trouble down the road if you leave it like that. We'll pop those 2 off so we can access the 2 7mm guide pin bolts. The top one, you have plenty of access. You can use the traditional 7mm hex, or if you've already equipped yourself with the stubby and the 12mm wrench, you can use those as well. Whichever one you like will work just fine. All right, that's good for now. We'll leave that one up there to kind of hold everything in place. We'll switch over to the bottom one now. This is where it's a bit tight, and this is where the stubby one really comes in hand. You have your control arm that's in the way, and the bottom of the shock mount, which is also in the way. I'm going to use my small flathead screwdriver to just pry or push the guide pins through all the way. You have plenty of room to see them in between the caliper and the carrier. They should look something like this. We'll go ahead and clean them up before we reinstall those. Same with the top one. Just going to push it through. There we go. We're going to hit these with the wire wheel when we clean them up. Now from there, it's just a matter of pulling the caliper off. And on this car specifically, in the XC90s, you can pretty much just rest them on top of the whole hub assembly. You don't really need to hang them off anything. While I have you in this view over here, we're going to go ahead and tackle the 2 13mm bolts that hold our caliper carrier to our hub assembly here. So a shallow 13 is going to be your friend on a ratchet or a wrench, whichever one you have. You can undo this ABS cable from the bracket there if it gets in your way, but you can usually just work underneath it. We'll go ahead and pull this out. And now we can take our caliper carrier bracket off. You're going to want to be sure to focus on these areas where the pads ride. Hit them with the wire wheel, maybe a little bit of brake clean before you reinstall everything. All right, my good people, in continuing the prep of our brake replacement here, the next thing we're going to do now that we're back up top is we're going to compress our piston. As you can see, I kept the old pad in there, and that's because I like to use those as a tool, hand in hand with our actual tool. That way, when this part of the tool starts going into our piston, we're not actually damaging the piston or marring the surface on the piston. Sometimes brake calipers will have a flat face piston. Regardless, whenever you can, use the old brake pad. Makes life a lot easier and makes this go a bit quicker. So we're just going to set up our tool like so. And at this point, we can go ahead and start compressing our piston. Another thing you can do out there, for those of you more avid DIYers, you can always open up the bleeder valve here and catch the brake fluid, so that instead of compressing the fluid back into the system, you're just letting it escape out of the bleeder valve, and then you can top up your reservoir as needed. That won't require you to bleed the brakes or anything. You're just simply letting out the old fluid. But in our case, this car has pretty fresh fluid, so we're not too worried about it. Once the piston's all the way in, you're going to feel the resistance. The tool won't want to spin anymore. That is going to be good. You don't need to overforce it or anything like that. If you find yourself having to force the piston back in, then you may have a problem with either the caliper, maybe a collapsed brake line, something of that sort. With that all the way in, we can go ahead and pop this old pad out. Now you can see on this car specifically, the pads were not so much the problem as were the rotors. Someone at some point did what we call a pad slap and just replaced the pads. Then replace the brake discs. The discs on this car are in pretty bad shape. They're starting to pit. They're rusty. They have a lip on the inside and the outside. So that's really why we're doing this DIY. Now with that, we're going to go ahead and work on removing the rotor itself. We had already broken our 10mm bolt free. Before we pull it out all the way, we're just going to go ahead and hit the brake disc with a hammer. As we know, it's seized to the hub. We're not even going to bother trying any other way. So now with our set screw a bit loose, but not loose to the point where it's going to drop the rotor, you can also stick a lug bolt back in. We're just going to go ahead and give the rotor a couple whacks with our hammer, break that corrosion free, and then we'll pull it off. And this goes without saying, my good people, but be aware, you want to make sure your parking brake is always off whenever you're doing a brake job, especially on a car like this where the parking brake is inboard, so the car uses a drum setup for that parking brake. At this point, you're going to want to clean up your hub as best as possible. Again, wire wheel attachment, maybe some light sandpaper, emery cloth. We're going to use a wire wheel today. We're going to clean up some of this corrosion. With that, we're going to hit everything with some brake clean, rebuild on the parking brake here at the same time, and we should be ready to install our new brake disc. All right, my good people, next on our list is going to be JR's favorite thing to do, which is hit the hubs with some liquid moly paste. Now, while Zimmermann doesn't require any sort of paste between the hub and the disc, the reality is we live in New England. These cars are going to see salt. They're going to get rusty. So whatever we can do to prevent them from marrying to each other for the long run, liquid moly paste is going to be the way to go. So we're going to apply a little bit on our hub, mainly where the rotor sits, and then we can go ahead and install our new rotor. You want to be sure that whenever you handle the zinc-coated rotors, your hands are clean, or change your gloves or go and wash your hands. You don't want to hit them with brake clean, as you will deteriorate the zinc coating on them. So do your best. Keep your greasy paws off of them. But with that, let's go ahead and grab our new brake disc and slide it over. And slide our disc over, just like so. We'll line up the set screw hole and get that started. The torque spec for that 10mm bolt is 10 Newton meters, or you can just use the old calibrated wrist and just snug it down gently. Doesn't take a whole lot of force. Whatever you do, just make sure your rotor is sitting nice and flush up against the hub. You will be good to go. All right, now we're gonna go ahead and install our carrier bracket. We're gonna go ahead and place that in its place. We have our bolts cleaned up, a little bit of Loctite already applied to them, so they're good to rock and roll. Again, if you're replacing them, the new bolts or the new hardware come with Loctite already. Now we're just gonna go ahead and snug these 13mm bolts up with our ratchet. With both of those 13 snugged up, now we're gonna go ahead and grab our torque wrench and just torque them down to 60 Newton meters. There's one, there's two. Again, not a whole lot of force, so don't gorilla them on there. They're not very big pieces of hardware. I'm just gonna go ahead and mark these for my own sanity. Now we're gonna go ahead and load up our new pads onto our caliper. Whenever I have a pad that uses these hooks that sit inside the pistons, I like to put a little bit of liquid moly ceramic paste on them, just so that they don't rust in there. And then you wanna make sure to hit a little bit on each ear of the pad where they ride on the caliper carrier. And there we can line it up. Just pop it into the piston. Make sure not to get any of that paste on the surface of the pad itself. We're gonna do the same thing to the ears on the outboard pad. Again, really just looking to put some on where they ride the caliper carrier, and that can sit there just like so. And now we can go ahead and just swing the caliper over. So let's go ahead and do that now. Now we're gonna go ahead and install our guide pins. These are 7mm hex, and then we'll take our 7mm stubby on our wrench. This is a ratcheting wrench, by the way, makes life easier. And we'll just snug those down. The bottom one, we're not gonna be able to torque just due to the amount of room that we are working with. However, 30 Newton meters is not a whole lot. That was 30 Newton meters right there. Don't forget to put your dust cap back on there. For the top one, since we have plenty of access to it, we will use a torque wrench and just finalize that one properly. There we go. Not a whole lot of force, my good people. We'll put our cap back on. And then last but not least is going to be reinstalling our anti-rattle clip. So let's do that now. The trick here is to get one ear down, and then you can kind of swing the other one over. The two small hooks go into the two small holes on the front of the caliper. So I like to get one started. Now with that, we can reinstall our wheel once more. But if you haven't done so already, I recommend you put a little bit of anti-seize or liquid moly ceramic paste, whatever you have on that hub there. Make sure you clean the wheel end as well so that they do not corrode and seize onto the hub like they did for us. So ours are good to go. We've cleaned up both ends. Now it's just a matter of getting the wheel back on. Now with them all situated, we're gonna just snug them up in a cross pattern. We're not gonna torque them down just yet, but I just want them to be flush against the wheel so that when we lower the car on the ground, we can torque them down properly. All right, my good people, with the car back down on the ground, we're gonna torque these lug bolts in a star pattern to 142 Newton meters or 105 foot-pounds. We'll start at the top and work our way around. All right, my good people, and with that, that is going to conclude this DIY for today. A couple things to note before you take off in the car. Be sure you hop in and pump the pedal a couple of times before you start driving. Then from there, braking procedure is going to be pretty standard. Do a couple laps, keep the speed between 50 and 10 miles an hour without coming to a full stop. Do some heavy braking with those. After you do that, let the car cool down, do a couple cool down laps where you're braking from maybe 30 miles an hour or so, again to 10 without coming down to a full stop. And that should be a pretty solid bed-in process for these TechStar pads. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, please be sure to leave those in the comment section below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.